welcome everybody who's watching it with this live stream. It's called Don't Give Up Ukraine. My name is Ruud Bij, and we are doing this weekly now from the start of the war. We are now on day 44 of the war. That means that this is our 7th stream. The subject of today is women and the war. And I'm very glad to have here Oksana Kis from Lviv, and you will introduce you in a minute, and Sylvia Borren, and I from Utrecht in the Netherlands, and you will also introduce yourself. And I do this live stream together with Orissa, and she will also introduce herself in a minute. So Oksana, will you just introduce yourself, who you are, and what are you actually doing, and so on?
Thank you. So I am a historian, a feminist historian, a historian of women, and a feminist anthropologist. I'm doing women's history since mid-90s. And I work for the Institute of Ethnology at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. I'm a head of the Department of Social Anthropology there. Yes, my main academic interest is in women's history, Ukrainian women's history, and I publish it on women's experiences of the Holodomor, the man-made famine in Ukraine in the 1932-33. And my recent book is on women's experiences of being political prisoners of the Gulag. Oh. So, yeah. And currently, that's my book, thank you. And currently, my current research project is on everyday lives of Ukrainian refugees in the displaced persons camps in post-World War II Europe, mainly in Austria and Germany. So it somehow resonates with present day events in Ukraine.
Thank you. Sylvia?
Yes, I have a civil society activist background, both as a volunteer and as a professional, which meant I became an activist when I had to fight for the rights of lesbian and gays because of my own relationship with my first girlfriend, which caused all kinds of trouble. And then I got involved in feminism. And my main jobs through the years have been that I was the director of Oxfam Novib, the Dutch Oxfam, for 13 years. We supported about 800 civil society projects in 60 countries, which is relevant to this conversation because I had a lot to do with war. And more recently, I was director of Greenpeace Netherlands for 6 years. And I'm now I call myself pensionada and active duty, and I'm still working with governance and integrity and doing various civil society jobs when asked as a volunteer. Oh yes, and I should say BRAC, which is a Bangladeshi development organization, the biggest in the world. I'm vice chair of BRAC International, so I'm still involved with all the topics I've ever been involved with in civil society.
And just before we started, you showed a book you produced already 50 years ago, I think. So
yes, this is an important book. It's from 2006, and it's about women survivors of various wars in Afghanistan, in Sudan, in of course Rwanda, which I was also involved with, but this is a book of women survive. It's actually a book. It's a terrible book, but it's a hopeful book with photographs and stories of women who've managed to go from being victim to survivor to social leaders in their surroundings, small and big. And it's a very interesting book. And I'll talk about some of the facts, because we think there's not been a lot of wars since the Second World War, but there's probably been 300 major war conflicts in the world in the last 75 years. And one of the main changes is that they're not about male soldiers anymore. They're mostly about women, and what the price is being paid by civilians and by women. And also the reconstructions are often, women play a huge role in that. But that's content.
Good. we come to that later, definitely. Lisa?
Yes, my name is Oresia Bila. I'm a philosopher. I work in Ukrainian Catholic University. I run the Department of Philosophy, and I'm also a head of master program in theology. Since theology is my first background, I came from theology into philosophy, and what really unites us here is that I did my graduate program in theology, also in gender studies. So I worked with this perspective of theological part connected with the women's and men's, but mostly like gender studies in a classical understanding. So here we start our conversation today, and
Thank you. Yeah. So we have very interesting experience together now, staying in Alkmaar, and changed my life to make it a bit personal, to you stay with us and that your little daughter is also here. So it's very special. Just one question before we started our subject, Oksana. How is life today in Ukraine, and especially in Lviv, and maybe especially for women?
Well, I have to confess that none of us, I believe the majority of Ukrainians really didn't believe that Putin at a certain point will decide to launch the full-scale war on Ukraine, although we knew about his empirical ambitions and his inclination, to occupy Ukraine. But at the beginning, we all felt like shock and dismay and confusion and fear. And I'm very grateful to a colleague of mine who actually managed somehow to engage me into volunteer activities. So I was participating in some volunteer work on sorting out the humanitarian aid, which started coming to Lviv in few days already after the beginning of war. And we were very busy, like putting things to the right place. And it helped me somehow, to survive those few first days, which were the hardest, I like mentally, emotionally. And then the refugees, the people who fled the endangered cities, started to come to the city of Lviv, to Western Ukraine, which seemed to be a relatively safe place to stay. And we had somehow, many of us, I believe like almost all the city dwellers started to take care of those poor people who had to leave their hometowns in search of safety. So a couple of days I was busy with some internally displaced people. And actually it took me about 2 weeks to go through all those 5 stages of acceptance, from denial through to the point where I was able to admit that the life has changed drastically, and that I have to revise all my plans and all my, schedules, and to adjust my life to the new situation and to do something. I had just to shift my priorities and to look for new options, and new opportunities, actually, to be able to remain a scholar and to do some kind of intellectual work, which I was trained to do actually, and to serve my society in the best role I can. So currently, when the city of Lviv is actually flooded with refugees, with internally displaced people, we try to learn to live together, because people come from different settings, with different experiences. Many of them are heavily traumatized, surviving bombing, witnessing all kinds of atrocities. So it's not that easy for us to get together and to be patient and to show empathy to one another. So it is difficult, but thanks God, the city of Lviv remains relatively safe. and I stay here, and I'm trying to do my best, to engage in the scholarly activities. And thank you for inviting me to join this conversation, this important conversation on women's experiences of war. Thank you.
Good luck to do that. And if you think about the life of women in Lviv, so today, is there anything special thing to say about that? So
I would say that many women, especially those I know from like academic circles, they are very actively involved in all kinds of volunteer activities, in humanitarian initiatives, helping people to evacuate abroad. Especially, a colleague of mine is a member of a group facilitating the evacuation of people with special needs, with disabilities, helping them to go abroad to get proper care and for recovery. Another person is engaged in organizing all kinds of logistics with humanitarian aid. Some people are engaged, women are engaged with helping the refugees to find accommodation and housing and so on and so forth, helping them to settle down and to find all the necessities they might need, because many of them just left their houses with their papers, documents in hand, nothing else. So they are confused. Sometimes they really need to be guided through the basic things. So many women in Lviv are engaged in different possible ways. Many are cooking for volunteer kitchens, to provide food for territorial self-defense unit, for army, for refugees. Many are engaged in shelters, providing help with managing shelters and collecting all the necessities and so on and so forth. So Lviv is basically working, in present day, Lviv is one big shelter for all those people who are trying to save their lives. And they continue to come from Eastern Ukraine, from Southeastern Ukraine. Probably you've heard that there are different, more or less successful attempts to evacuate people from Mariupol and those small towns around Mariupol in southwestern Ukraine, southeastern Ukraine. So, and they already suffered a lot. So they really need some safe place and some empathy and help, and they need to calm down and somehow to recover. So there is a lot of work. And this is, I would say, what I can observe here on the micro level, it's not about institutionalized activities, it's about like personal activity, and I would call it emotional labor. When women are trying to help other people to overcome the trauma, to manage their emotions, to alleviate their stress and depression and despair. So they help them to manage their very bad emotional state, to live through all those pain, just by, showing their empathy and love and care.
Yeah. I remember one of my friends from Lviv. She was in a meeting with my colleagues here, and she took her child. She had a very little child to her parents. It was about in a village, I think 60 kilometers from Lviv. And it made a huge impression of everybody, because she said, well, now my child is safe, and now I'm ready to fight and even to die. And it was a very emotional, but I won't forget this, because having your child in a safe place, in a shelter, is in that sense so important. But then the resilience she shows, well, it was very impressive for us all.
Now, my question to you would be, to Oksana specifically, since your book about women experiencing Gulag in the labor camps of the Soviet Union, it's been translated into English. It was published recently in Harvard series, and it's very popular. It's also very interesting. It's a kind of experience that we were never talked about before. I don't remember a book about, we have few books about Gulag, really about the experiences in the social anthropological level, but really, I think this is probably the first one about female experience. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, and when we talk about the war, of course, as you mentioned, this is a real atrocity and nobody expects this. But the war has a man's face. That is how traditionally it happens. And the women are seen as in the position of weakness, in the position of being the first victims of war, together with children. Now my question would be about the of your experience as a scholar working with the documents and witnessing of the experience of women in Gulag and your experience of today. Are there parallels between these two experiences? What can we really learn? One of the things that I would like to emphasize here, it's a beautiful name of your book. It's a Survival as Victory. Could you tell us a few words about this?
Sure, absolutely. And there are many parallels and many aspects to think about in terms of how can we learn from the experiences of those female political prisoners of the Gulag, and how those experiences could apply in our present day situation. Of course, when we think about women political prisoners of the Gulag, we immediately categorize them as victims of the Stalinist repressions, right? And it is the case in a pure sense, but when I was reading their memoirs and listening to their stories, I just realized that the women, they perceive their experience not as an experience of suffering and loss, but as an experience of overcoming and strength, and actually the experience of being the winners, the ones who won the situation, won the battle with the Soviet regime, by the very because they survived it, because the regime aimed to destroy them physically and mentally, and they survived it, and they were able to preserve their social identities as their selves, their human nature, and for them it was the victory. So at certain point I realized that we should take into account their own perception, their self-perception, their self-representation. Why? And when we think about the history of Ukraine as a nation, quite often it's a narrative of suffering and oppression and all kinds of aggression and victimhood, because for centuries we have been surrounded by the other nations which wanted to conquer us, to occupy, to subdue, and to exploit Ukrainians. The imperial Russia and other nations tried to subdue Ukraine, to colonize Ukraine, and there was all those policies of Russification, so on and so forth. And of course, it looks like we were the victims in the course of history. But if we change a little bit the angle, we can perceive the same period as the period of successful resistance. Of course, we didn't have the huge victories on the way because our power was not equal, of course, but we survived somehow, and we somehow managed to preserve our identities, our value system, our culture, our customs, our language, so more or less successfully. So we somehow, that was a history of resistance and the history of long-term defiance to all those powerful enemies which were like trying to destroy us. And here, the metaphor which comes to my mind, it's a metaphor of a drought-resistant plant in the desert. You know, when there is unfavorable condition, desert condition, that plant just spread the seeds, and the seeds are sitting there in the soil, waiting for a favorable situation, for an opportunity to sprout up and to come to bloom and to vegetate and to grow. And if the situation is unfavorable, and again, then the seeds are again sitting there in the soil. So it's all about Ukrainian nation, which was able to preserve the core value system, the core traditions, the culture, the essence of its culture through centuries, with some short periods of success and long periods of unfavorable situation, historical, political, cultural, economic situation. And now it's another challenge for Ukrainian nation. And we can look at this situation as an opportunity for Ukrainian nation to show its survivability. It's a natural feature of Ukrainians to survive all the time, all the challenges, all the hardships, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to my, again, about my book, I was looking on at women's everyday lives in the Gulag, and I was trying to figure out how in the situation when they were deprived of all rights. Their opportunities and resources were extremely limited. I mean, those imprisoned women, but somehow they managed to resist that dehumanizing effect, the destructive effect of the Gulag regime, and to preserve their human essence, their human selves, their social identities, gender identities, national identities, Christian identities, if you want, and even the political ones, because many of them were Ukrainian nationalists. And I realized that there could be different ways to resist. And in terms of those imprisoned women, those was non-violent forms of resistance. It was just a transgression of the camp rules and regulation, seemingly minor transgressions, but on the large scale and on permanent basis. So they did what they considered important to do. They sing songs, they embroidered, they prayed and organized improvised liturgies. They did all kinds of things which led them to maintain, to uphold their social identities, to do what they considered to be important for them, to remain human beings, to remain Ukrainians, women, and Christians. So that non-violent resistance, which manifested itself in a very mundane things, mundane practices, could be understood as a form of counteraction to the totalitarian regime. So that was the point I was trying to make at the end in the conclusions of my book.
I think, can I come in on this? I think what you're describing, I recognize very much in all those countries where I've seen war, slumbering war, atrocities. And I think what women don't want war, but when it happens, women find ways to, it's in your first part of your reaction, it was about your own volunteers work and organizing and helping. And there are so many examples of women in Rwanda and Eastern Congo, in Liberia, I mean, South Sudan, I can go through Afghanistan, so many examples of women who find each other and they organize for orphans, for neighbors, they organize from the kitchen outwards, if you like. And in that, there is community being established, even in the most atrocious situations. And they support each other through the most ghastly traumas that you can hardly imagine, and help each other out of the victim role into the survivor role. And I agree very much that that's a great indication of courage. And then often into new kinds of social leadership. And I've seen that so often. And interestingly enough, I think I'm very glad about your book, because I think the real problem is that wars are not described in terms of what happens from the kitchen outwards. They're described in terms of, now too, everything is about which battles, which armies, which and not about the organizing behind that, even organizing for food and water, and there's so much generosity even in such incredible situation. That goes for the refugees that ran out of Myanmar into Bangladesh. I mean, I've talked to many survivors who tell this story, that in the midst of huge fear and trauma, there is camaraderie, there is singing, there is helping each other, there is supporting each other. So, and in the reconstruction, women always play a huge role too. So I really identify with what you're saying, and I think I think the stories are there. That's what the book I was pointing to, and there's many other stories I know, but I don't think we're telling that story. We're telling the story of the women as suffering, and not the women as leading the change that is needed.
Mm-hmm. So the suffering is real. Huh? So
the suffering is real, and I cannot begin to tell you the stories of mass rapes that I've heard, and the stories of, there's many. The suffering is real, and I'm not saying that every woman survives that, because of course they don't, and both physically and psychologically. But I understand that becoming to act, and the acting is often practical. It's how to organize yourselves in small ways, and how to then try and help in small ways. And I think acting is a very good, working on a voluntary basis or however, is a very good way of coping with the incredible depression of what's happening.
I cannot agree more. One of the core concepts of my book is agency, women's grassroots agency. When we start asking questions beyond the victimhood, not only about what women suffered, but what actually women did, or what women do during the war, or during other periods of extreme violence, we start seeing women who are helping one another, who are taking care of one another, who are taking care of other people and kids and pets. What we observe in Ukraine, how many women are engaged in rescuing abandoned pets in those destroyed cities where there are like thousands of dogs and cats abandoned, terrified, and injured, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of the maximum manifestation of humanity and kindness, and people are really generous, as you said, in sharing the scarce resources they have, but they always have this kind of compassion to those who are in a war situation, and they try to help each other. And here I want especially to just to support your your idea about looking at women as being agents of their own lives. But the women's agency is less visible, and quite often it is taken for granted. It's not appreciated properly, albeit it helps the society to survive, to overcome the terrible atrocities, to cope with all those atrocities, not only physically on the level of food provision and so on and so forth, but also on the emotional level, to overcome trauma, because people need somebody to listen to them, to show their love and care, and so on and so forth. And women are doing that on a permanent basis. And that emotional labor is not measured somehow. It's not calculated. It doesn't go to the record, how many people have been helped, emotionally. It's a kind of like the society expects women to do this kind of work on the daily basis, but in the situation of crisis, we finally start to appreciate how important it is.
But actually, women are good at it too. Women, because women often run complex lives with work and children and older relations, and so women are good at organizing. I think actually women are really good organizers, and so also in crisis, they've also got the emotional responsibility to look after those kids and the elderly and the pets, if you like, etc. So I think it's really an important example that your book gives, that we should and the book I have does that, and other writings I know do that we should bring the unseen labor to the surface and see that that's an important part of civil society. And that's not just the NGOs organizing, that's the actual survival on the ground organizing that I'm talking about. And the soup kitchens. I know so many places in Africa where orphans are not left by the side of the road. They're picked up and they're helped. And, there's so many examples of this. And I don't think we're telling that story enough. And when we talk about a war, we're telling the stories of the weapons and the bombs, and we're telling the destructive story, but not the constructive story. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
So if you think about this a little further, so this emotional labor is concept is already referring to this work done but not recognized publicly, not paid for, and that's at least how I know the concept of emotional labor. So, but is there something, if you connect women and war, or women or the experience you are referring to, is there a special thing what refers to women in relationship of this reconstruction? You actually talk about, Oksana, about the ethics of care in your book, as I read it. So is there a special relationship that makes women more, at the same time, not recognized in this, and on the other hand, as so very good at it?
Actually, this concept of ethics of care, it comes from the Freudian feminist thought, but it relates to a certain attitude and certain practice women interiorize in course of their gendered socialization. So women from the very young age are trained to become universal caregivers, to take care of others in different circumstances, mostly in the family setting. But when it comes to the situation when everybody is in need, women suddenly show their skills because they've been trained to take care and to be attentive, to comfort other people, to make sure everybody, to take care of well-being of people around them. So it's not something essentially inherent in women's nature, but it's something women are trained from the young age in the patriarchal society to be a caregiver. So for women, it becomes easier because they are skilled in that, to take care of people in need, of people who suffer, of people who feel bad in a specific way, either they are hungry or they need shelter or they need some medical assistance and so on and so forth. So women are just good in providing care because they've been trained for that. Even without any special education or profession, like they are not nurses, but they could take care of elderly and family members and other people. So that's the point in the setting like Gulag, in Gulag camps and prisons where women were kept in gender homogeneous settings, so women kept separately from men. It turned out that women took care of one another because their care impulses, their attitude was directed to other women around them. So that was a milieu where everybody virtually took care of anyone. It doesn't say that there were no conflict, no tension. Of course, those are the live human beings in extreme situation of shortages, of pain, of violence, and so forth. But what I observed from those stories, I had a chance to read and to analyze, to explore, and 150 of them, women really appreciated the help and compassion and care they experienced from their sisters in misfortune, and they speak of one another as a community of sisters, as a sisterhood, as a quasi-family relation which characterized their relationships to other women they spent years together in the situation of survival. So they had to rely on one another and to take care of one another. So that mutual support groups were extremely important for survival, actually. When it comes to the present day situation in Ukraine, what I see, how the informal women's network started to activate the friends, the acquaintances, the relatives, they ask one another in search of help. So somebody is coming to the city of Lviv, there is a refugee family looking for a shelter, and everyone starts asking friends and relatives if there is any apartment or room or something, looking for help. And these those informal networks, they are actually very efficient in finding solution for special requests. So it works on a personal level, but it's also about informal networks. And I would also point out, you mentioned that women are like good in multitask activities, and that's true. And when we look at even at the governmental level in Ukraine right now, there is Vice Minister of Defense, she's a woman, Hanna Mahler, and another, the Minister of Veteran Affairs, Yulia Laputina. They deal with military issues, and they are very efficient in what they do. They look terribly, how to say, yeah, there is fatigue of all those efforts because it's much strain and responsibility, but they continue to do the job, and they are related to military. And there are women who are dealing with humanitarian issues, and there are those dealing with diplomacy, and they are efficient everywhere. It's not like women are related to humanitarian aid only or to the home front, but they are everywhere. And there are lots of women at the battlefront in military units, and they are snipers, and they are machine gun operators, and they are doing all kinds of
all kinds of things. But I think there's two comments I have. One is that it would be good if there were more women involved in the whole negotiations. And when I look around the rooms of the negotiators, it seems to be we're back to males. And the other thing I'd say, and this is something that is not just to Ukraine, but I recognize it so much also in the different African wars and Asian wars. I think the women, how can I put this? Gender, the bodies of women, also of lesbians and gays, of sexual diversity, are somehow the battlefield for me between the authoritarian fundamentalist view of life and the more democratic liberal view of life. And that seems to be fought out literally in the mass raping and the anger. And you see it, of course, now again in the Taliban in Afghanistan. And but somehow the need to control women on the fundamentalist side and destroy women even, which is now shown in Ukraine as well. And that is something we're both agents, but we're also the battleground of that fight between fundamentalism and liberal democracies, I think. And that's not recognized enough either.
I think we have here what I also in regard to this remark, what I see now in Ukraine is traditionally Ukraine is divided. There is always, when you start talking about gay rights or women rights, there will be always two sides taking parts and bringing up huge discussions and kind of like going in different ends. But what I see now in Ukraine is really a type of a solidarity, and this is also showing something really important here between Russia and Ukraine that we see today. Russia, with its inclination to tradition, which is very much invented tradition, so to say. To be honest, this is a tradition that they just, wrote on their knee and they kind of represent themselves as the protectors, as the advancement of tradition into the world that is ruined by the modernity. And Ukraine and the role, what I see of gay people also who join a lot army today, and you know, it breaks down the traditional image that gay people are just standing there all alone and they never participate in civic events of the type. And I see women that show this extreme you know, they expose the bravery and the solidarity and support to the entire society. They really become the foundation. That's for me also a way to see Ukrainian society as the modern versus this, you call it fundamentalist. Yeah, that's probably even the more correct word than the traditional, because it's not really a traditional society that we are fighting right now. It's a also authoritarian society that actually uses tradition as an excuse.
Exactly. And interestingly enough, what you're describing now, you know, when you talked about the ethics of care, I mean, this is often forgotten, but of course that's part of my life. And when the whole AIDS hit the world, the buddy system between gays and lesbians and people who were sick was really in care. The voluntary buddy system has been something which was huge and discovered in our through my gay friends and organizations, and has been taken over in all sorts of ways in the ethics of care now. And of course, women were doing it, but so I think this goes for minorities in more ways, that when the necessity is there, that humanity shows through, even through the oppression. I mean, I think fundamentalist is the better word, and you can talk about religious fundamentalism, economic fundamentalism, Russian fundamentalism, but it is often, it's not even true that that's the historic reality. It's but what does fascinate me is why the anger is so enormous. Why the anger towards freedom and liberal democracy. What there's something there that I don't understand. And it's not just, that's not just gender, but there's something there that I don't fully understand.
Maybe I come back to something you said before, Sylvia. So you said, well, what women should be more involved in negotiations. That's what you said.
Yes,
now, I know for what you told me, you have been involved in that yourself.
Well, I was for 5 years. We had an attempt for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to try and find solutions, and we did it with feminists. We had 25 feminists from the Israeli side, 25 feminists from the Palestinian side, and 25 international feminists. And the international feminists, which I was one of, were not there to mediate at all. We were there to say, if we can get this solved, it affects us all in the whole world. So we were looking for solutions. And it was not an easy route. I'm not going to pretend. It was very hard work. And we did it under UNICEF, one of the UN women's organizations. But we actually found a way forward with ourselves together, both in how we looked at the history and how there were solutions. And but we actually, after those 5 years, we actually got quite high up, talking to top of defense in USA and UN and in different countries. And we had peace conferences in places like Spain. And we spent quite a lot of time, our own time and work on this. It was all, again, on a voluntary basis. We actually gave up in the end because we were not effective enough at the right level. So, but it gave me a deep experience of very, very difficult conversations where one word could trigger half a walkout out of the meeting or whatever, deep emotions, of course, in the Palestine-Israel situation, deep different views of realities. But our feminism pulled us through that we were wanting peace. We really wanted peace. And I think if you look at the peace movements historically, I haven't done academic study of this, but I think they have often been dominated by women. The peace movements in the 70s and 80s, disarmament, nuclear disarmament, we don't hear them so much now. Partly, I think, because some of those sisters, and I've met many of them, are now in their 80s or 90s, and I'm not sure that we have, apart from the actual crisis that's happening in Ukraine now, but women need to take this. We need to say stop the war, and there are places where that's worked. Ireland was solved because women said this is enough. I mean, a lot of places. South Sudan is solved because women said this is enough. And women do that because they take their responsibility for their children and their future and their society. But I think we're not loud enough. I think we need to, and it's not just women, of course, it's always with the men who understand feminism and who understand the importance of getting beyond the traditional gender roles and all that. I mean, it's, but men need to take that position too and speak out on it. Yeah, I really believe that.
Oksana, I was also thinking about the same issue. So what you could connect it with what Sylvia just added before about this puzzle of aggression. So where does it come from? Why is it so destructive, and so on? And you could say, well, involving in peace negotiation as women is somehow a game changer in that. So you could fantasize, you could think about it. And do you see some future nowadays in Ukraine for women to be the game changer on this board? I was thinking about, well, your president, Zelensky, a couple of days referred to the mothers in Russia, so to say. And so it's your children who are killed, and it's you raised them, so in that sense. But is there an option to think about how women from Ukraine and Russia could connect on changing this, on acting together in that sense? So the concept of act is very important. It's maybe a fantasy, but still I think something important to think about.
That's a very difficult question, and this is about a moral choice, by the way. You know, at the beginning of the war, several public figures, I mean, famous women from Ukraine, the pop stars and the actors and writers, they tried to speak to the Russian audiences and to persuade them that this is unjust war and it has to be stopped, and the Russian women have to influence their government and Putin and call upon their sons and husbands to come back and not to fight against Ukraine and not to kill innocent Ukrainian people. They tried to
activate,
somehow to reach to their hearts and to somehow to explain that this is a bloody war, and the women in Russia should stop it, but nothing happened. Nobody listens to them. I don't know if the people in Russia are so brainwashed, so they are just blind and just don't know and don't want to know and don't want to understand anything, and they are happy living in their country and watching their sons dying in Ukraine, killing, murdering people, making all kinds of terrible atrocities and the bloodshed here in Ukraine. At this very moment, let me be honest, I see no way to talk to Russian women at this moment.
Because in Belarus, it was the women who stood up. It was a lot of the demonstrations that have all been squashed again, but it's often women who took the forefront in that as well.
Right. Yeah, that was a different story with Belarusian protests 2 years ago, when the Lukashenko actually did what he wanted to do with the elections. But now I believe we are in a terrible pain now, so we cannot speak to our perpetrator, to the country which is in a role of a rapist, a violent rapist. We cannot negotiate at this very moment, you know. And yes, I would agree that more women, professional women, should be allowed to this negotiation team, so their voices are there and they could probably bring another perspective, and probably their suggestions or their point of view would change the dynamics of those negotiations. But at this moment, I don't think the negotiation as such is really a serious thing at the moment. It plays any role at all, because when there is an active stage of military activity in Ukraine and all those terrible fightings, it continues, the battlefront is in full action. What kind of negotiation is there? What we are discussing right now, when the people continue to die and people are continue to be murdered, tortured, and raped and robbed, and the cities are destroyed, and the besieged Mariupol, when people are just dying, they are starved to death. What kind of negotiation could be there? I don't know, and I don't see myself in the role of communicating with Russian feminists to discuss how can we solve the war, like in peacemaking, process. It's not a peacemaking process. It's a war of extermination of Ukrainians.
Yeah,
so we have to defend ourselves at this stage, and probably later on we could discuss how we can find some reconciliation afterwards.
Well, I wouldn't say this is about reconciliation, but I agree with you, of course. So, and I think one of the things what we want to do is don't give up Ukraine. Is this, well, the situation today is terrible, and it's like an existential struggle. So for Ukraine to be in, and not an existential struggle for an abstract country, but from people for flesh and blood, men and women who are doing this by the day, so to say. And just if you have seen Bucha, so the last couple of days, and the story keeps going on, and probably it will be worse. So it's hard to say, well, okay, can we get something below the level going? So, but it's also to think about the day after tomorrow, so to say. And that's more why I was thinking about, for instance, Belarus as a U-turn, so to say, not directly with women in for instance, in Russia, but maybe Belarus. I don't know. We had our Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana. Come help me, please. Yes. Alexievich. Actually, she did something like you did in your work. So in a book about women and so on. So this was a bit that's why I call it fantasy, but it's also about imagining something that is hard to imagine if there are some, especially in what you are describing in your book, what it's under so immensely difficult situation for women to live in, to erase their identity and their existence and so on. And they found some resources. And you actually in the concluding chapter, you sum them up, basically. That's this and this was helping. And how to use this in this situation. That's basically where my question comes from.
But I think it's not about reconciliation, and certainly my Palestinian-Israeli international hours of my life that I spent there, it showed me that it's not about reconciliation. It's actually about finding the terms of justice, and I do fully believe that in countries where, and I know a lot of countries in the world, but in countries where the position of women is, where the difference between the position of men and women is big, that's where it's harder to work towards justice. So there's a connection to the gender reality on the ground. And in countries where, funnily enough, Rwanda, after the terrible genocide where 800,000 were killed, and then many more raped and killed in Eastern Congo afterwards, and that's still going on. But actually, because so many men were also killed, Rwanda's got some of the best figures of women in universities, women in the parliament, women in the, I mean, far, far, far better than the Netherlands. So, you know, and if you look, I mean, I've read other books about causes of war, and it is also often about unemployed young men who don't know where to go and what to do. That can also be then manipulated into war and war crimes and things like that. So there is a huge, there are huge gender questions that are possibly at the basis of the cause of war, and certainly in reconstruction after a war. It's not for me about reconciliation. It's about justice.
Yes.
About justice.
Justice. I very well remember I was on a conference a couple of years ago in Bucha, and that was basically the same. It was just after 2014, and this was also called reconciliation. And our general discussion conclusion was reconciliation was basically the wrong word.
Yeah.
It should be justice.
Yeah, I agree. I agree very much. But I totally understand what you're saying, that this is not the time to ask you to spend energy on reaching out to Russian women, because you're too busy in Ukraine now and defending yourself and helping each other. So that's a question that could be asked of other women around the world, but not of you, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yes, it's something to think about, Sylvia.
Yeah.
So we are almost already an hour underway. So we have to, and we lost Orissa.
Yeah, what a pity.
I don't know why, but maybe it had something to do with her daughter, which stays here. So that would be very. So maybe to finish this a bit, I have actually still two questions. The first is in your book, Oksana, in the concluding chapter, you sums up quite some of the, how do you call it, resources or mechanisms or something like that helped women in the Gulag to survive and to win, to victory, so to say. Is there anything there what you can transpose to the situation now? Because the situation now is, of course, different from the situation in a Gulag. So, and maybe, and this is for me a question of your both. Maybe we should have started with it. But actually, what brought you to do this study as a person? So why did you do that? And it's also my question to Sylvia. So you are involved in this, and actually women and war, what struck you about that you say, I'm going to write about something like that? So there's two questions basically for you, Orissa, and one for Sylvia.
Well, what about the reason why I started to research this specific topic? It just happened to me because my general research, my wider research was about women's experiences of living in extraordinary historical situation, about the everyday life in an abnormal situation. And I started with Holodomor, the man-made famine, and then I moved to the wartime experiences, and I looked specifically on women's participation in the Ukrainian nationalist underground, and the stories of women who participated in the organization of Ukrainian nationalist and Ukrainian insurgent army usually lasted until those women have been arrested by NKVD and sentenced to long-term imprisonment in the Gulag. So I just moved forward with along the lines of their biographies, their stories, and I started to read more about the Gulag and political repressions and political imprisonment. And suddenly I discovered that actually nobody bothered to write something about women surviving the Gulag. So there were some statistics, there were some data, some general research about the Gulag as an institution, about its structure and the history of the Gulag and administration, so on and so forth, and even about some demography. But what happened to people who lived there, who survived there for years and years and died there? So I felt it's so unfair. So it's an injustice to people who survived that much. So I felt like a feminist scholar, felt it's my duty to bring those stories to the light, and because I feel it's a kind of our legacy, our women's legacy. It's all about our foremothers, and we could learn from their experiences. We could take some very valuable lessons. And one of the major lessons I took from their stories, it's about women not being a weaker sex, a fairer sex. Women are not the weak, human beings.
I couldn't agree with
not
you.
Be protected. They have inner strength and inner power. Quite often they are not aware of those power because they are all the time taught they are weak. But in some situations, some circumstances, suddenly they discover they are much stronger than they thought before. And another important lesson, which is already I can observe in the present day situation in Ukraine, about the most efficient survival strategy, it's solidarity.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. And also women work towards equality. Women don't like inequality on the whole. And I think really the lesson is that the stories of women are still not heard enough and not researched enough and not asked enough. And I mean, in my years and years of working with Oxfam Nova, with the international Oxfams, I was often asked, how can you cope with the terrible situations you've seen, famine and war and refugee camps and etc. And I always said, I've seen the worst. I've seen the worst slums. I've seen the worst poverty. I've seen the worst. But I've also seen the best. In those same situations, there are the strongest who stand up and organize themselves. And those are usually women. And but we're not documenting our own voices enough still. I mean, and that's maybe a message for you to your academic sisters. What you've done is you've followed the line and then you've discovered something which was never documented. But I think that's true for a lot of histories of war as well, and particularly also of reconstruction. I think the stories are terrible, but the stories are also hopeful. I think this is the book I was pointing to before, is the most ghastly things that have happened to women, but their resilience, their strength is incredible. So I think that should be recorded much more.
Thank you. So we're now in the end of our company, and I was thinking about you are an heir to one of my favorite Russian poets, born in Odessa and died in Petersburg, Anna Akhmatova. And she wrote the Requiem, and the Requiem started when she was in line in the prison, where you probably know it, where her son was staying. And then there was a woman behind her with blue lips and asked her, "Can you describe this?" And then she said, "Yes." Anna said, "Yes, I can describe it." And the woman started to laugh. So in this tradition is being a witness of resilience, a witness of survival, and a witness of victory in the end. I think that is a way you are to put one of your concepts, Oksana. You are acting in a sense of Hannah Arendt. You're making a new beginning. That's beautiful. So I want to thank you very much for being here. Also, in the name of Oressa, of course, and hope to see you again. The next time next week, we will be again here. Our subject will be related to Easter, resurrection. So you can imagine that would be an interesting thing to talk about. And well, thank you very much for being here, and hope to see you again. And good luck to you, and good luck to you all, Oksana.
Thank you very much. Have a peaceful night.
Have a peaceful night.
Thank you, Ruth.